Thanks, Gabor. So yeah, as Gabor says, I'm Aimee, and I'm part of the data science team at Mango. So I was really excited when I knew I was going to get to give this presentation about this project today. But I had a real issue when I started to think about it, and that was what was my title of my talk going to be. I ended up with this really long title that, as Gabor just forgot as well, I keep forgetting all the different words, but we ended up at using R to model multi-billion-dollar mortgage assets. But it could have been any one of a number of things. We could have called this talk, How to Implement an Analytic Workflow in a Week. We could have called it, How to Scale Simulations in the Cloud. We could have called it, How to Build a Model Comparison Framework. Or we could even have called it, Why Analytics Should Never Be Attempted in Excel. So hopefully you can get a feel just from these possible titles the extent of what this project involved and some of the challenges that we were facing. Now, to start off with, I've got to tell you, we can't actually talk about the customer and we can't talk about the ins and outs of the models that we fitted and so on. But today I'm going to talk to you at a high level about the project, the challenges that we faced and how we overcame them. So hopefully you'll get a feel for how cool this project really was. So the project started, we got a phone call from the customer. They asked us if we could come down to their site. They needed some help with some work they were doing. At the time, we knew basically nothing about the project. We hadn't even signed an NDA. But Rich and I went to London. We'd packed for 3 days, but we had no idea how long we were going to be in London for, if it was going to be just a couple of hours or even a week or longer. So we didn't really have a clue. So it started off on the customer site, and we had a meeting with the customer. They were an investment firm. And they were looking at whether they should bid for a very large mortgage portfolio. They were looking at both the question of whether they should bid, and if they should, how much should they bid for this portfolio. And to give you an idea of the size, the sort of money that they were talking about, the guide price was around €7 billion for this whole portfolio. So we could see straight away this was a really interesting question. We were ready to get stuck into this. And then we talked a bit further and started to realise what some of the challenges were. The first challenge was that the deadline was in 6 days. So we had 6 days to overcome everything and fit this model and give them an answer. So we were already starting to think this was going to be a bit tricky. The next challenge was that the data was all held in Excel spreadsheets. So all of these mortgage portfolios, all the assets, all the information that they had was all in Excel. And they'd been working for some time in Excel to try and do this analytics themselves and realised, as I'm sure you're all aware, that Excel wasn't going to scale for them with the sort of numbers that they were talking about. The next challenge was that they actually wanted to, during this modelling process, implement a series of business rules. Now, these were all held again in Excel spreadsheets as formulae that had already been applied to data. So we didn't have a nice list of, here are all the business rules that we want to apply. We had to actually figure out how we were going to extract that information and store it and apply it. The final challenge that we had of the many on this project was that there was a lot to compute. They had around 120,000 mortgage assets that they wanted to model. They wanted to run a simulation of 10,000 iterations, and they had 8 different sets of business rules that they wanted to apply to this to see what was going on, what might happen. So really, really challenging. At this point, Rich and I were sat thinking, this is maybe going to be a bit difficult. But we thought, you know what, let's go ahead, let's try this out. And we immediately got back on the train, headed back to the office, called up and said, we need a team to work on this over the next 6 days. And I should say those 6 days weren't 6 working days, it was 6 calendar days. So we had a weekend in the middle of that too. So what did we do? How did we get started? So we headed straight back to the office and we got our team together. So obviously we realised there were lots of different components and we'll talk in a moment about the actual team that we put together. The next step was to get a collaborative environment available for us. You might have seen Richard's talk yesterday on the data science workbench, but that allowed us to quickly get that environment together that we could all work on this analytic project together. Probably one of the most important steps in this project was splitting out the workflow. So we had a huge workflow that we had to work through, a really short amount of time to do it. The only way to do it was to break it down into chunks and each take a separate component of this. So it was really important before we started any work to say what were all of the steps in this process, what are the inputs and outputs from these steps so that they can be worked on separately. And obviously there were a lot of zeros on that slide before, so we knew this was going to be a pretty intensive computation. So we got IT involved right from the start so that they could tell us what we needed to do so we could quickly scale this project. So, the team, who did we get involved in this project? Well, it wasn't just a team of data scientists. We did have 6 data scientists on the team. We had a whole load of modelers. Again, you might have seen Richard's skills radar yesterday. We picked out our modelers who we knew we needed to work on this project. We also knew from all of these numbers that we were going to need that IT consultant involved, so we got them on the team as well. Now you might be thinking, the bottom one there, we actually got 2 business analysts involved in this project. You might be thinking that might be a little strange for an analytics project, but actually it was vital for us to actually complete this project in such a short amount of time. We were going to break this project down, so we needed people's involvement from the business analysts who were going to see it from a high level, who were going to see the whole process from end to end, what was going on, who was doing which bit, what the data looked like, what was going on with the business rules. So their involvement was really important. So as I said, we broke the process down for this whole modelling project. So what was that process? Well, first of all, we had to start with our data capture. So as I said, all the data was held in Excel. We had to capture that data and then prepare it for analysis. Of course, we had the modelling step in there as well, so we were going to have to model these payment behaviours from historic data so we could run simulations forward in time. As I said, we had all these business rules that then had to be applied to our predicted data, so we somehow had to manage that. They wanted to be able to tweak them, and we had to manage those business rules. Then was the actual simulation component. So we were going to be running this forward, and we had to have a stage just for focusing on that. And of course, any analysis project, the final component there is reporting. We had to report this back to the customer to tell them what we had found and the information we'd got there. So we broke this down into 6 stages, and we broke our team up and assigned everyone to a different component to work on. Now this photo here was actually taken during the project. We basically took over one of the big offices and lived in this room for 6 days. I'm amazed actually we were basically there the whole time, and yet this photo was taken when nobody was in the room. But you can get an idea from this of how we actually went about working on it. Now we usually produce lots of documentation, but here we needed the whole team to be able to see that very clearly at every point in the project. So if there were any questions, any issues, everyone could see what was going on. So as you can see here, we just stuck all of the information up on each stage, all around the walls. The brainstorming there you can see on the board. It was all available to the team for the whole of the project. So just to talk in a little more detail about some of these different components. So we started off with the data capture. So as I said, it was really important so that we could work on this separately, that we clearly define the inputs and outputs from each stage. So here we handed this to one of our data scientists and we said, look, we've got all of this raw data, that's what we're going to give to you, and what you need to give us out the other end is data objects in R that we can then work with. So they had that clear idea of where they were starting and where they were going. The way we went about it, we took all of these Excel spreadsheets, all 120,000 of them, and stuck them straight in a MySQL database. So the only way we were really going to work with this effectively and quickly was in a database. So that was the first step. Now, of course, I'm sure you're all aware, we can then easily write all the wrappers to that to connect to the database, pull the data out, and give us the correct information at each point. So we were going to be simulating each of these individual mortgage assets. So we then had all of these functions that would pull the correct data out that we needed from the database. The next step, so as you're all aware in analysis, we then need to clean our data, get it ready for analysis. So we started out this process knowing that we were going to have these data objects pulled from the database. So when we started this section, we knew we had these initial data objects, and we knew we needed to get to analysis-ready data. So we're not even thinking about analysis still at this point, it's still part of the cleaning process. So we had all of the usual aggregation and subsetting. We had to merge lots of data together to get the information we needed to fit models. So all of that was done in this particular step. And again, we were really clear on what the inputs and outputs were for working independently on this. So the modelling was then the really interesting point, because we had 6 days to fit a model, to compare models, and to decide on which was going to be the best model to look at this mortgage data. So we had all of this historic data, we had tons of it, we had 120,000 data sets. And we knew we needed to build a model that we could apply to the simulated data so we could simulate one step ahead predictions. The important thing was that we needed to use the same model for all of the data. We couldn't have a different model for different data sets, it all had to be the same. The way we went about this, we actually pulled a couple of the data scientists onto this section of the project, and we essentially gave them the same data to work with and asked them to fit different models. So simultaneously they were working independently on separate models. We baselined that so that we could compare back to a very simple model, so just a simple linear model as a baseline, and we worked on 2 different approaches, one machine learning approach and one more statistical model, a usual model that you might fit. So they worked on that independently, and we were able to then compare those models with the same data sets using all of the inputs that we had from the previous step to generate and determine which was going to be appropriate. So it was really easy then to separate this out, work on it separately to everything else. So the business rules was actually quite an interesting one as well. What they wanted to do when we'd simulated what was going to happen at the next stage was to say, okay, if this person has paid their mortgage, that's fine. If they haven't, are we going to send them an angry letter? Are we going to take them to court? Are we going to give them a break from paying their mortgage for a little while? All different rules like this. And they were based on both the predicted value and the historic data. So what had happened in the previous 6 months, for instance. Now, what was really important to the customer was that they wanted to play about with these rules. They wanted to say, okay, let's tweak that one and see what happens differently, or let's change that component and see how it works out. So they had to be easy to change and apply. So we couldn't just write fixed R functions that were going to do this. They had to be adaptable. So in the end, we had to write a series of R functions that would parse these rules and convert them into R functions that we could apply. In actual fact, they mostly ended up being sort of if and else statements. So if they've paid, do this. If they haven't, do something else. But we had to deal with that. We had to manage that. And our business analysts were actually really important at this stage to help us out with managing that and implementing that. And as it says at the bottom there, we started out with some baseline rules, so we had to have somewhere to work from, something to run this on initially. So we baselined some rules after discussions with the customer that were sensible to work on initially with this stage. So the simulation itself, so we've modelled all the historic data, we've got these business rules that we want to apply. What was the actual process of the simulation? Well, the first thing was we simulated just the next step. We weren't simulating the next 6 months, we weren't simulating the next year, we were simulating just the next payment. So were they going to make that payment or not? We then had to apply the business rules at each step. So based on whether they've paid or not and how much they've paid, what was going to happen to them then? Were they going to get an angry letter or such like that. So again, at every single step we had to apply these business rules. And finally, again, at each step we had to generate a cash flow report. So at this point, has their mortgage payment gone down? Have they been fined? Has the amount they have to pay back gone up? We had to generate that at each individual step, and that then flowed around in this process back into simulating the next payment that was going to happen. So this was a circular process, and importantly, it all happened on each individual stage. So hopefully from what I've said so far, the numbers that I'm talking about, what we actually had to do, you can start to see this was going to take a long time to actually run all of this simulation. So as I said, we had around 120,000 mortgages, 10,000 iterations of each one, so we wanted to average over that. We were asked to run this forward for the next 50 years, so simulating one step ahead, but we had to do that for the next 50 years. That was quite a challenge. And we had 8 different rule sets that we had to implement, to trying out on each of these different sets of simulations. So once we had the end-to-end process going, we sat down and we looked at how long this was going to take to run, and we worked out it was going to take 4.3 years of compute time to actually run all of this simulation. Now, we had 6 days to do the whole project, so we didn't have 4.3 years. So what did we do? Well, it was actually a really, really parallel problem. There was no interdependency between mortgage assets. They were all separate. Each iteration was actually separate, so all of those 10,000, they were completely independent of each other. So we moved to the cloud, we used AWS, and all of that IT involvement at the start of the project helped us out at this point to do this seamlessly. So we used Docker images, as Rich mentioned yesterday. We used these Docker images that the whole team was working on, and that meant we could then move to the cloud without much issue at all. So then we pressed go, and we started running, and we just had to wait to see what was going to happen. So what was the outcome? Unfortunately, I'm not actually allowed to tell you. It was a really cool project, though. In summary, hopefully you can see this was really interesting. There were a lot of challenges that we had to face in a really short amount of time. There was a lot of money riding on what came out of this as well, so just a little bit of pressure to add to that. What worked really well for us was that splitting of the workflow, splitting of the team up, knowing exactly what was going out in and out of each stage, so we could work on it separately, but all working together towards one end goal. We actually found that the business analyst was essential in this project. So they were sort of looking at the whole overall flow, while we were able to then focus on each individual step of that project. Just to give you an idea of how crazy this was, the photo that you can see here was the fish and chips order for the team one Saturday afternoon. As it turns out, fish and chip shops aren't open in Chippenham on Saturday afternoon, so we never got these fish and chips. Never mind. So hopefully you can see that was a really exciting project that we were involved in. I'm very happy to take any questions if you have any.